All right, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to DFDL's Employment and Labor Practice webinar, where we will provide a legal perspective to the latest issues and developments in local and regional employment in Southeast Asia. I am Paul Volodarsky, Deputy Head of the Regional Real Estate Practice of DFDL, and I will be your moderator today. Today, I will be joined by my esteemed panelists in the area of employment and labor who will share their insights on the recent developments in the hospitality sector. Marion Carles Salmon is the head of the Regional Employment and Labor Practice at DFDL. She advises clients on cross-border and local labor and employment matters, data protection issues, and mergers and acquisitions. Over the years, she has gained extensive experience in IT, hospitality, and the oil and gas industry. We are also joined by Dragana Bajić, his head of the Regional Employment Practice for Kinstellar, a leading independent law firm in emerging Europe, Turkey, and Central Asia. Dragana has a substantial experience in labor law and employment matters ranging from individual employment contracts to complex restructuring of workforce and mass layoffs. We've also been joined by Devjani Mishra, who is a shareholder in Littler's New York office, where she advises management regarding all aspects of the employer-employee relationship. Devjani is one of the leaders of Littler's COVID-19 task force and a return to work team, helping employers navigate the unique workplace disruptions caused by the global pandemic and the accompanying business restrictions. Prior to joining Littler, Devjani spent 7 years as the primary in-house employment counsel for a publicly traded global company operating in more than 50 countries. She is a regular presenter on employment law topics at the American Bar Association, the Practicing Law Institute, the American Employment Law Council, and in other forums. And finally, we are also joined by Aline Boulom, who is the Director of Mobility and Recruitment of Accor in Upper and Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia and the Maldives. Aline is an HR and cross-culture expert who has been living and working in Asia for the past 15 years. Aline is in charge of the mobility and the recruitment of expatriates. She supports 200 hotels and resorts located in Thailand and throughout the region, around Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and in the Maldives. With an increasing number of hoteliers directly affected by the sanitary crisis, Aline has confronted everyday issues with the impact of COVID-19 on businesses and employees in the industry. So today we're going to go over a lot of these different issues that are coming up for the hospitality sector throughout the region, especially in light of the COVID-19 situation that has affected border closures and the ability of hotels to conduct their business in the region. And this has especially hit the tourism sectors around the globe. So as part of this, we're going to ask our esteemed experts and panelists to join us in giving us some insight into the types of issues that they're encountering and what they see in the coming months and years ahead. So in terms of setting the scene for the COVID-19 update, I'd like to ask Aline Boulom, what is the state of the hospitality and tourism industry in your region? And just give us an overview for the audience.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Actually, so of course, the hospitality industry, same as the transport airlines, is immediately affected by, of course, the closing of the borders and the ban on international traveling. So it affects all our hotels, and in our region, 200 certainly, not at the same time, depending on their location, on their main business, and so on. But the situation is really bad, actually, and it's an unprecedented crisis. And it doesn't. We don't have a clear visibility on until when it's going to take place. The main challenges that are faced by the industry, and especially in our region here, is that these borders remain closed, and months after months, we see that the governments are extending this measure. The protocol for quarantine is very strict, and of course, it makes all the movements very difficult. The airline traffic is almost inexistent, and that means there are no tourist arrivals, which means that the hotels have to really count on the the local market, the domestic market, and this is definitely not enough. We can see the limits. They have generally also not enough after having used the savings or some amounts put aside by the owners for the risk management. Most of them have had to take measures because, of course, they do not generate enough revenue to support the payroll and the fixed costs. So that's really all the aspects of a very lengthy crisis where we have no visibility and which handicaps more and more our industry in the region.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to move to Devjani Mishra, who's in the United States, to give us a perspective from the US.
Sure. So it's nice to be with everyone, and as Paul said, whatever time of day it is, for those of you, anyone who's here in the East Coast time zone, I salute you. It is very similar in a sense to what Aline described. Anyone who's familiar with the U.S. market knows that the restrictions are still in place very much. One of the unique features of the U.S. response to this pandemic has been that it's handled on a regional basis, and you can have a lot of variation among the different states and localities in terms of how they are responding, what restrictions are in place, what timetable has been established for potentially reopening different parts of the industry. And really, regardless of the region, I think it would be an understatement to say that the hospitality industry has been hit very hard in the United States, whether you are talking about hotels and resorts, whether you're talking about restaurants either in or outside of hotels and resorts, events, catering, other types of entertainment. All of these have been very severely impacted. In part, that is driven by what people are willing to do. In part, that's driven by local restrictions on the types of activity that can take place. We're beginning to see some variation in terms of what types of facilities can be reopened and on what basis. This is in part driven by the statistics. So here in the Northeast, where we've been somewhat more successful in containing the virus, you're beginning to see some things reopen a little bit. But by and large, the Northeast and the West Coast of the United States have taken a more safety prescriptive approach. The Southeast and the Midwest have been a little bit less conservative in terms of allowing things to stay open longer, attempting to reopen things more quickly. And we're beginning to see some of that rolling back as the statistics continue to change. The other thing that is really affecting a lot of employers is different types of legislation that are being passed in different regions. So in California particularly, but beginning here in the Northeast, we're starting to see legislation that affects the order in which employers must rehire those who have been laid off during this period of time or let go from their employment. So there have been protections put in place for individuals based on seniority and other considerations to make sure that people are brought back to employment if they were let go by their employers over the summer. We are seeing some forms of temporary relief for the employees in these industries. There was unemployment assistance provided by our federal government for a period of time. There have been some limited paid leave of absence made available for individuals who are sick or who are dealing with care of children because their schools are closed. And of course, we're seeing activity on a collective basis from our unions to extend benefits, to extend health benefits, particularly for individuals who may not be working at this time. Of course, here in the US, we have the unusual situation where health insurance is often tied to employment. It remains to be seen whether there will be any additional relief extended to the industry or to individual employees either before or after our upcoming election. So that was quite a lot of information, and I'll stop there and defer to the rest of the panel for now.
Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting. And why don't we move to Dragana Bajić to give us a perspective from Europe.
Hello to everyone. Well, in this part of the world, obviously, as everywhere else, the hotel and tourism industry has hit an all-time low when it comes to revenue figures. We've seen in many of our countries, we've seen that the domestic tourism was on the rise, especially during the summer. However, the capitals, the tourism in the capitals is still suffering because there it largely depends. It's reliant on international tourists, especially. Currently, during the summer, there was a considerable relaxation of restrictions. So a lot of the employers put in those back to work measures, and a lot of things were starting to look more normal. However, in the now as the autumn has begun, we've seen a surge in the numbers of coronavirus cases throughout Europe. Some of our countries have reinstated the state of emergency. So as of today, for example, we have a state of emergency again in Czech Republic, in Slovakia. In some of our countries, we still have the state of alert or a kind of a lockdown, which is like a relaxed lockdown or epidemic declaration. Which also enables the governments to introduce some preventive measures related to health to prevent the spread of COVID virus and mostly just wearing of the masks and prohibition of public gatherings. However, it is expected that things will change for worse even more, because here in our part of the world, we are expecting also that we will be hit with a flu epidemic soon, in a month or two. So it will be interesting to see how things will evolve once we have the epidemic of the coronavirus and the flu epidemic. So we expect a lot of problems now as the year comes to an end. Also, there were a lot of economic relief measures that the governments in this part of the world implemented. Especially in springtime. So it was between 8 March and May and June. However, now a lot of the governments have announced that they're thinking about new economic relief measures, because the situation is obviously going to continue for quite some time, and a lot of the industries are hit very badly, especially hospitality industry.
Thank you so much. And I think, in light of all of these issues, what I'd like to, and I think what our audience is really looking for is also some ideas of what are some of the most common or successful HR optimization strategies that have been seen and helped by companies in the hardest hit sectors, retaining quality employees, how has this been affected in each sector? And if I can come back to Aline on this issue.
Yes, Paul, actually, over the months, we have, of course, given guidelines. At the beginning, we have really tried to collect as much information as we could from the different countries, labor law, where our hotels are, 9 of them, so very different all across the region, and try to see what's possible or not. And then we have supported our hotels, our general managers and the owners, to put in place different measures and the more the time was going, then of course the more we had to be creative and to open the field of such measures. So different options have been put in place and in line always with country labor law, starting of course with clearing of the annual leave. Okay, so very often in hospitality, we know this industry is very much dedicated full time to the guest satisfaction, and it's not. It's quite often that the employees at all levels have a lot of annual leave pending. So it was certainly the best option for this year to start and use all the annual leave balance. Then, when this was exhausted, right, then we had to move to the next step, and that has been the leave without pay. So leave without pay, with a challenge which is that many employers believe that you can be on leave without pay, but still continue working. So we had also to really help them to understand that when you are on leave without pay, you are really on leave. And it was not only because, of course, it respects the law, but also because these employees had really a lot of commitments towards their own family, their own community, and they really needed to make sure that if there is no schooling or if some elderly in the family were not anymore supported, so they had to really be there, right? So to make the best use of the leave without pay. After that, the third step was the salary pay cut with employees. And as DFDL always very clearly mentioned, especially also in the last webinar of last week, it has always to be with the employees' consent. And in this part of the world, it is always very, very difficult to challenge to make sure that the employers, when they put this, when they agree together with the hotel to and they announce this salary cut, that it will be with employee consent. So we have a lot of issues coming from this implementation of a measure, right? In some hotels, we have been able to put in place a COVID-19 allowance for the low-income employees, and to keep also to make sure that there are restructuring, let's say, not still a redundancy plan that came later, but at least a skeleton team. When we obtain that the hotel has to, we always try to convince the employers, the owners, that the hotel closing completely is not necessarily a solution, financially speaking, because it's a very high cost to close it, high cost to reopen it, to rehire many people. So it has always been also another long work of negotiation discussions to help them understand that they should maybe work on a skeleton team, keep the minimum of a hotel, close some floors, for example. So all our teams from the corporate office and in the hotel, the hotel directors had to come up with a lot of scenarios of possibility to close and make some savings, closing parts of the hotel, the outlets, and so on. Yeah, but really try to convince to keep the team. Maybe also some of them not anymore on salary pay cut, but even suspended from work. So keeping a contract that tell them you are still an employee, we will not pay you, or maybe just a medical coverage for the period, but it means when a situation improves, then we will take you back without having to go through the recruitment process. Okay. Yes, so after that, when it was, you know that in our region, it has been also, but I think it was also worldwide, no more possibility to gather in restaurants, for example, or to drink alcohol, so that it would avoid any people to come together in a group. But when it was starting again to reopen, then of course the first part of the hotel we could reopen were the restaurants. And at least the good thing with this, when we have started to reopen that, was to generate revenue, of course, which is a good thing for the owners, but also to generate service charge, and that means to increase the level of morale of the employees, who were very much depressed for many of them, right? We also have another way to optimize this talent, because it's not only about financial aspects, right? It's about to keep these talents who have grown with us, many of them very connected to our company, Accor, for so many years. who knows so much, who are very solid pillars for the company. So it was for us a big challenge to keep track of these talents. Okay, and we have very soon started under the umbrella of our crisis committee to have what we call a talent at risk tracking. So every week, making sure that with the vice president operation in charge, we go through the list of all of them, from general managers, number 2 in the hotels, head of departments, and to see really, to have to exchange about what we know, where they are, how their situation, are they still in the hotel, or how do they live, very concretely to know what's their daily life. If they are about to be terminated, what are they going to do next? Do they have some savings? Are they going back to their home country, and so on? So it's really a very personal tracking. And we exchange because, of course, some VP operation know them together, and we also bring the HR knowledge in it. And all together, we feel that we keep together this group of talents that we cannot afford to lose. Right? Even if we know now that more and more with the time going, and we don't have any position to offer to all of those who have lost their job, in the next few months, there is not much recruitment happening. So we give them the green line, certainly, to find their own way, to go for independent companies, maybe, or independent restaurants, to have ability to survive, but of course, to welcome them back. And among these talents, of course, we have also those who are star talents in terms of potential. So these ones, of course, also are very well tracked and supported. So we spend a lot of time calling those who are still in the country, maybe sometimes stuck in either in their home country where they were when they were maybe on annual leave when the borders closed, making sure that they are able to find a way to come back and resume their work, or at least to come back to negotiate and finalize their termination conditions. So that's all the measures we have put in place, and I will describe one of them also, which is quite innovative, a little bit later in this presentation, Paul.
Okay, great. And I think I know Marion has done a lot of different analysis on HR optimization. So I'd like to ask her to also weigh in from a lawyer's perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this new webinar. So as Paul mentioned, this is actually a webinar from a long series of previous webinars where I have the opportunity to present some of the options that we have seen in the market. And I think Aline gave us a very good overview of, the kind of measures that have been implemented. So maybe I won't go back to the annual leave arrangement, which were already presented. But maybe I think the first obvious, if I can say that, option will be first, contemplate salary freezes. Of course, due to the downturn and downtime, companies will probably think that it's probably not the best time to consent to a pay rise to their employees. So from a legal perspective, this is relatively straightforward to implement, unless, of course, the employees have a contractual right to a pay rise in their employment contract or in a collective labor agreement. But in practice, we rarely see that. So Aline also presented, and this is unfortunately for employees, one of the tough measures that have been implemented, but salary or working time reduction. So again, of course, subject to the employee's consent. But speaking of that, some things that employers need to be careful is if the jurisdiction in which the salary reduction is implemented has a regional minimum salary, of course, the employer needs to comply with it. The salary provided to the employee should not be lower than this regional minimum salary. There is some jurisdiction in which, the changes and the salary reduction must be notified to the competent authority. So this is notably the case in Cambodia, where, the reduction of salary must be notified to the Ministry of Labor, or in Myanmar as well. So this is also important to notice. So another measure that we have seen and which was, I would say, largely implemented at the beginning of the crisis is the salary deferral. So I think now things have stabilized a bit and company came back to, I would say, more permanent arrangements. So salary deferral are sometimes still used, but I would say less than at the beginning. But just the salary deferral is actually a very interesting tool because it will provide cash flow flexibility. But this is just a deferral. So at some point, you know, the company will still need to pay the salary. So interesting measure, but yeah, maybe not for the long term. And another, I would say, measures that we have provided advice to our clients is in terms of performance bonus, you know, because in the current context, of course, companies have left with no choice but to maybe rethink how, you know, the performance bonus can be granted to employees, and in particular the performance metrics, because first of all, this is not fair, you know, to rely on the same performance metrics as before the crisis, because these metrics are no longer feasible, they are not realistic. But also, you know, I mean, how can I justify to pay well, of course, this will concern only a very small portion of the population, but how can I justify to pay very high bonus when, you know, I ask in return employees to make sacrifice and to accept salary reduction? So, I mean, overall, there is the necessity, you know, to rethink these performance targets. And so we have been, you know, contacted by clients to actually effect how we can amend, you know, these performance metrics. So it's kind of difficult to provide like one single answer, because of course, you know, the regime will depend on the jurisdiction where, you know, the performance bonus plan is implemented. But in general, you know, if both the principle of the performance bonus and the performance metrics are expressly provided in the employment contract, then you will need to get the employee's consent. If by contrast, the performance metrics are provided in a separate document other than the company's internal rules, and such documents provide that the employer may amend its term from time to time, its term and criteria from time to time, then in principle, the employer will be entitled to amend unilaterally the performance target without obtaining the employee's consent. So this is the general rule. Of course, you know, some jurisdictions have taken, I would say, a more conservative approach. Thailand being one of the, being a good example, because in Thailand, the law says that if the performance plan has been announced, any adverse change will be regarded as a change in working conditions, and as such will be subject to the employee's consent. So this is, of course, for the companies very constraining, because we are not, I mean, here we are only talking about, you know, changing the performance metric, changing the performance targets. But the reasoning is that since, you know, these performance metric will ultimately have an impact on the employee's salary, then the employee's consent must be required. So if you are a small company, I mean, only 10 employees, I mean, it's not that easy to implement. But indeed, if you have, if you are like a large conglomerate and if you have like 1,000 staff, of course, then it may raise issues, practical issues, but also issues coming from employees who do not want to sign the amendment. So in Thailand, it is possible to rely on the implied consent, but of course, I mean, from my perspective as a lawyer, I would say that it's a bit clumsy, because you still have the risk that the employee challenges, you know, at some point, you know, the change and say, yeah, no, I mean, my consent was not implied. So the first and the first thing I wanted to cover is that the situation where, you know, the performance plan and the performance metrics are provided in the company's internal rules. So in that case, the employer will have to follow the procedure to amend the internal rules. So where notification to the labor authority is required, notifying the labor authority and so on. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much.
I
think
thank you.
You know, that leads into some of the other interesting issues that have been coming up in the hospitality sector, which is, you know, what do you do when you need to move employees from one location to another? I think, you know, working with a number of hotels, we see that that has been an issue with border closures. But I'd like to start off with Devjani to talk about some of the issues that she's experiencing in the U.S.
Sure. So one of the interesting things here again is that in addition to the border closures that we have, and I think to put it more fairly, that other countries have, which prevent U.S. personnel from traveling to those other jurisdictions, we also have internally, as a result of this regional approach that I was describing, restrictions in traveling between states. And so, you know, with other types of challenges, you may have seen in the past companies moving staff temporarily from one location to another internally because maybe there's extra need in one location and extra capacity somewhere else. So for example, you might see a hospitality company moving staff temporarily to assist with a grand opening activity and bringing in experienced personnel from another location in order to supplement the local staff or help train. These days, we have to factor in that a number of jurisdictions, particularly here in the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, but also some cities, Chicago, Washington, D.C., have implemented travel restrictions. And this is something we have seen on and off throughout the pandemic period. Hawaii has been another location which obviously depends a lot on hospitality, but has imposed effectively an inbound quarantine, so that if travelers are coming from a location that is deemed higher risk and they enter the state, they are expected to isolate or quarantine themselves for a period of 2 weeks, restrict their activities as much as possible. And there are exceptions for what are considered essential workers, but generally most hospitality employees and operations will not fit into the definition of essential. We had a bit of an exception early on, particularly when hospitality employers were providing housing for medical personnel and healthcare personnel who were responding to the crisis. And so in those settings, there might be essential hospitality activity, but for the most part, regular hospitality does not fit within these exceptions. And so what that means is if you want to bring personnel into New York, you have to look carefully at where they're coming from, possibly take other health measures, engage in health screening and testing and so on. So those restrictions definitely affect movement within the United States. In terms of expats who are already here, which I know is a subject that is close to this panel's heart, since we have a number of expatriates on the panel, we have seen, you know, with the more stringent immigration enforcement over the last few years, that individuals who have been here on long-term visas are receiving extra scrutiny when it is time to renew those visas. And so what had been very routine renewal processes and reapplication processes for individuals to extend their visas has become much more involved. Very often something that would be routine is now sent back several times with requests for more information, and some things where maybe in the past it would have been a request for information are being outright denied. So in terms of your workforce planning, if you have individuals who are here on long-term visas, intra-company transfers, L1s, and arrangements such as that, it becomes more difficult to plan because it's not necessarily the case that you will be able to extend the permissions for individuals to live and work here. And so this has been another part. Aline had mentioned, you know, the high potential talent. It's very often in the past been routine or customary for companies to move high-level personnel back and forth to gain greater experience and greater cultural knowledge as individuals are promoting through the company. Those processes have been challenged for the last few years, even before the pandemic, and it remains to be seen how the continuing restrictions will affect that and how a different immigration approach might affect that.
And I think that that's been something that a lot of us have been dealing with, as expatriates. As Devjani said, a lot of us on the panel are expatriates that are located in different areas. And I'd like to ask the same question to Marion in terms of what she's seeing from the Southeast Asia perspective.
Yes, so I mean, as Devjani, exactly presented it, I think we need to make a distinction between the inbound transfer of employees and outbound transfer of employees. So inbound transfer of employees actually can be, I would say, an interesting tool for employers who have, different entities in the same jurisdiction, in the same country, but who may not need, to have their full staff on this entity. And by contrast, to have another entity or another company, which is doing quite well, and for which, they would have the need. So of course, this is a little bit optimistic, but I mean, in some jurisdictions as Vietnam, we have seen that in practice. So in terms of inbound, transfer or relocation of employees, it's regarded as a transfer of employment contract. So unfortunately, I won't have the time to cover all our jurisdictions because we are at DFDL present in more than 9 jurisdictions. So I'll take only the example of Myanmar and Cambodia. But in Myanmar, the law is silent as to how you can transfer, the employment contract of your employee from one entity to another. But if you want to effect the transfer in practice, we recommend drafting what we call a tripartite agreement of transfer and the new employment contract. Of course, the employee's consent will be required, with also, the obligation to notify the change to the competent labor authority. But I think what is very interesting to note, and sometimes, our clients and companies in general don't really get that point, is that since, you need to rely on the employee's consent to ensure, greater cooperation of your employee and to encourage the employee to sign the agreement of transfer, we generally recommend that the terms and conditions of the original employment contract are not less favorable with the new employer. So this means the new employer taking over, the length of service. This is what, employees will look at, and also all benefits. So this, this is an interesting tool, but yeah, of course it comes with a price, but when it's possible, I mean, we generally recommend that. So this was for Myanmar. Cambodia has, I would say, a similar approach because the law is also silent on how you can effect the transfer. So in Cambodia, either you can agree with the employee that he or she would resign under the tripartite agreement of transfer. And of course, you need to enter into a new employment contract with the employee. But in that case, you need to, but in that case, and actually the benefit is that you don't have to pay any severance or termination amounts upon the termination, but you need to transfer this payment obligation to the new employer. So this is something that, in the group, they should take that into account. And the second option that we have seen and that is largely implemented in Cambodia is the mutual termination agreement, followed by, the making a new employment contract with the employee. So in that case, of course, this secures the termination because in general, in mutual separation agreement, you will have a provision in which the employee agrees to waive any claims that he may have against the company. But in return, the employee must be paid with the minimum compensation entitlements. And in general, this goes with the payment of an ex gratia payment. And the last thing I wanted to mention, and this is something that sometimes company forget, but if your employee is hired under what we call a fixed duration contract, in principle, the mutual termination agreement must be signed in front of the labor inspector. So this is really important. So this was for the inbound, what we call inbound relocation of employees. Outbound relocation of employees, I think it's really similar to the US in a way that, all the countries, even those which are doing well, and I'm thinking about Thailand and Vietnam, which have both, I think, controlled the virus internally. But I mean, in most of the jurisdictions, the borders are closed. And in Vietnam, for instance, all issuance of new application of new work permit are still, I mean, they don't issue any work permit for now. So yeah, this is, I mean, in terms of outbound relocation, of course, I mean, the situation makes it very complicated.
Yeah, and I think, I'd like to get Aline's input on this, because I know that she has had to deal with some of these transfers and getting employees across borders in different jurisdictions. So Aline, can you give us some of your insights on how you've dealt with this?
Yes. So first, all our hotels are independent entities, right? So when we talk about career development and transfers, actually, it is more like ending an employment contract, starting a new employment contract, and we don't have any in this region. We don't have any hotel owned by Accor, right? So it means we always make sure that the transfer is, of course, good for all parties: the employer, who will have fresh blood in his hotel, the employee, who will go and see new horizons and develop, and us as a management company, who will benefit from this move and make sure that we guarantee an interesting career to our employees, we develop them, and we keep the hotels running with new trends and new blood. Because in the hospitality, you at the level of management, right? You have a lot of the duration of the tenure in a position is usually around 2-3 years, and after that, the employee themselves, in the majority of the cases, they really want to see something new country, new brands, new type of hotels. So we are very active on this usually, and it is basically my role, right? So my time, my year is normally spent into checking the talents, going where they should go next, and organize the legal aspects of this, ending a contract properly where they are now, and sending them, if possible, if they are excellent, we keep them in our region, of course, and that's it. So last year and the past few years, we have, just to give you an idea, I have secured and written the employment contract for 60 general managers, 60. So it's more than one per week, but it means a lot of time spent in discussions, negotiations, selection, interviews, and so on, and writing, proposing packages, and so on. So you can imagine 2020 is completely different. So very limited recruitments, and if so, then it will be certainly, and that's where we come to exactly the heart of your question, it will be in the same country, because of this difficulty of considering crossing the borders. Okay, so for example, Vietnam, we have a lot of hotels, and that's where we have had recently like 3-4 hotels looking for the new general manager, right? And that was a key requirement. Who do you have as a talent available in Vietnam? Okay, so it means for us, the relocation, we have made it minimum. First, what we have decided is to make sure that all employers would keep the employees longer, right? Extend contracts in case of a limited time contract. So keep the contract, extend the contract until 2021, if possible. So no relocation. Anyone who has a contract in hand, keep it, and keep it as long as possible, because so far, if you stop the contract now, we don't know where you would go next. And second, it is the ones who are coming to the end of the contract, or the employer will terminate them. What do we do? Okay, and that's where the relocation, for me, it's not so much about, we can hardly accept it if it's in the same country, and it could work. So case of Vietnam, terminated in when I say terminated, it's not necessary, because our GMs or hotel managers, they don't really resign, actually, they really wait for the good transfer to be moved to another place, right? And so in that case, it will be limited to the country. We have one case now, but it's really an exception, and it has been lasting for months, where we have one of our great talents currently in Cambodia and wants to has been recruited for a hotel in Vietnam. Okay, so the good thing with this is the contract has been signed. It's only about the starting date, but it has been for many months since the process is ongoing and the doors not being. We have even considered having this person coming on the river by car, walking across the border, you know, because it was really impossible in another way. So it's an exception, but it's so complicated. We will just do that and support this because it's a key talent for a key hotel, right? For us, otherwise, crossing the borders for our foreigners, for our expatriates, and in general, it's really when it's no other option possible. For example, as I mentioned before, a general manager was on annual leave when the borders closed, so stuck in the home country where he's been on annual leave since March, and the employer in Vietnam doesn't keep silent, doesn't do anything, doesn't pay him salary anymore, but doesn't want to terminate him because of course that would cost some money, right? So keep silent. And what we are trying to do is to push for this employer to do all the paperwork needed for this person to come back to Vietnam, because he still has a job, he still has all the papers there, right? And at least be able to finish his contract properly, okay? Do the handover and finish. So this is the kind of relocation we try to make happen, because it's a completely locked situation, right? So, but this has been already for several months. And in another way, we have, for example, this one has a contract. Another quite common situation is the foreigners who are ending their contract in the country, be it Myanmar or Philippines, and there is no place they can go. They cannot. They could only maybe go to their home country, and with a relief flight or some flights supported by the embassy, or even now I think it's quite possible. But these employees, they are reluctant sometimes to do so, because they know that most of their career was in Asia. That's where they want to go and be. Probably their partner or their spouse is in Asia, and they may have their only asset in Asia, right? Plus, they also know that if they go back to Europe or Australia, whatever, we will, let's say, forget them. You know, they feel that they will be away from this where they would like to be working and where they have also so much experience. So they are reluctant to do so. And then that's where we have to really take care of them individually. It's not that we can do much in this case, but at least listen to them and make sure where they are. For example, Thailand, since March until now, there is an amnesty for the visa. So we have a number of our employees, foreign employees, who have been without a job since March. And at least as long as the amnesty is there, we know that they can stay without any fine in this country, right? But my role is also to make sure that, I mean, my role, it's not in my job description, but I want to make sure that these people are aware. What do they have to do as soon as the amnesty is finished, right? Will they have to jump in the first plane, or can they do that even before, or whatever? So that's where the relocation, actually, we have to handle it, but it's not that it's not part of a career development or transfer of people as we would do. And the last, but not least, is the case of crossing the borders due to medical reasons, right? We have some cases of our senior talents who have been affected by some trouble, medical or psychological issues due to the COVID, due to a lot of pressure. And that's where we were very grateful to have a good support from medical assistance insurance, who took care. But it was also a very complicated trip back to the place outside of the country of assignment where they would be treated. Yeah. So that's a couple of very concrete situations that can show you that we are trying to freeze completely. Yeah, that's it. We are trying to freeze completely all relocations across borders because it's really difficult to handle, and we focus all our attention on emergency cases.
Okay, so I think you know, the next practical issue that I think has been on everyone's mind is what do HR managers do in the event that an employee tests positive, and also, you know, in line with that, you know, what do you do about employees that are afraid to come to work, noting that we're now coming into a second wave of cases now in Europe? I'd like to pass this over to Dragana.
Thank you. Well, if an employee tests positive, how you deal with that depends, especially on whether the government authorities, you know, will investigate that particular case further, the contacts of this person. So in a lot of our jurisdictions, you know, once someone tests positive, then those epidemiological teams, you know, from the public health institutions invest, you know, ask around, you know, ask this person, you know, about whom this person was in contact with, you know, within the last week or two, and then the interviews go. They find those contacts, and for each of those contacts that they find, usually they would issue an order, a self-quarantine measure, so where this person would need to be then at home, you know, for 14 days usually. So this happened mostly at the beginning, you know, and when we had a large peak of numbers in most of our jurisdictions, the authorities could not handle this investigation of contacts, you know, on a large scale. So there were in a lot of those cases, this was something that only the employer needed to deal with. In most of our jurisdictions, there is no obligation to report to the authorities if someone tests positive, so an obligation of the employer. There is no such obligation. And then you will rely on the internal measures, preventive measures in most of our jurisdictions, all the employers needed to prescribe in advance, you know, a policy on the measures and steps and what preventive measures for against the spread of coronavirus among employees, so at the company level. And these measures always need to include the steps of what what to do in case there is an outbreak of COVID-19 cases at the company. The measures depend, and also the mandatory rules related to the measures depend from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but almost always there is a mandatory obligation to disinfect the rooms that were occupied, you know, the premises that were occupied by the employee that was tested positive. Then closing that division, you know, temporarily for at least 2 weeks where that employee worked, or send the employees home to work from home if that's possible. So if not possible, then you send those employees. In most of our jurisdictions, you can send them to a paid leave where they get the compensation of a certain percentage of their salary. If the employees as proven contacts of those of the employee who was tested positive got an order on self-quarantine, that they would be placed on a sick leave if it's not possible for them to work from home, and they will get a sick leave payment. As I said, the measures depend and vary not only from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but also on the type of the job or the business activity of the employer. There are usually no particular specific measures that are just for the hospitality industry, rather than those when it comes to steps that you need to comply with when you have a have an employee who's tested positive. So in none of our jurisdictions we notice that that there is an obligation, to close the hotel or the restaurant at the hotel if an employee is tested positive. So yes, that's about it. Perhaps we can. Yes, one of the things that becomes important there is what to do with the guests. Perhaps some of you will have something interesting to say about that. But in this part of the world, as I said, because there is no obligation in most of our jurisdictions to report to the authorities that there is a positive case, so you don't need to inform the guests as well, but you need to do all of those preventive measures, which include, as I said, disinfection of the whole area where the employee was. So and also, of course, to keep on implementing those measures which apply regularly to the hospitality industry. Wearing of masks for both the employees and the guests as well in some of our jurisdictions, and distance between people and tables. So that is it. No specific measures there.
Okay, and Devjani, what about in the U.S.? What are you seeing in terms of the obligations for HR managers when an employee tests positive, or if you get requests by employees that they're afraid to come in due to the nature of the hospitality sector?
Sure. So many of the steps would be similar. There is variation, again, state to state. So what I'm speaking from is really the recommended approach for this, because you'll find as you go state to state that certain states have been less restrictive on this. But in an essence, the employee who is positive should be sent home for a period of at least 2 weeks, or at least sent out of the workplace. Hopefully they will not be hospitalized, but if they are, so be it. And then steps should be taken by the employer, by the hotel, to determine who are the people that have had close contact with that person. Were the appropriate safety measures being followed? Were people wearing masks? Were they engaged in social distancing, or were there individuals who had close contact with them? One of the things that this requires is a certain amount of advanced planning. Prior to the pandemic, it might have been routine for employees to exchange assignments or exchange shifts, and maybe people would trade shifts. So someone would be scheduled for Monday and trade with a coworker to be there on Tuesday. We find that employers are having to take steps to limit that, because you want to limit how much exposure anyone is having to the entire rest of the population. So maybe it would be more feasible to have one team that may have exposure taken out, but another team is ready to go, versus if every person who's employed has had exposure to every other person, that becomes very difficult to manage taking people out of the workplace. We, again, have differences in the public health infrastructure in terms of whether reporting is required. Some states require the employer to report to the Department of Health that there is an infected employee. Others do not, but they expect the employer to cooperate if the health agency is investigating a case and trying to engage in contact tracing. So this is an area where it's very important to look at what the rules are that are locally applying to the situation. Another issue here in the U.S., we have very limited paid sick leave. Many hospitality employers provide it as a benefit, but in many locations there is no legal requirement to provide paid sick leave. And so one difficulty has been the problem of employees coming to work even though they may be sick because they do not want to lose pay. And so employers are definitely encouraged, given that this is a contagious pandemic, if there is no paid sick leave available normally, or if that paid sick leave has been used up, our CDC, our federal health agencies have recommended that an employer may want to temporarily adopt some paid sick leave in order to encourage employees not to come to work. In terms of the issue of notifying guests and others, this is obviously a very tricky issue. It is rarely the case that an employer will be required to notify any non-employees of exposure, but I think this really falls into the area of, hospitality. customer relations, guest relations. As a hospitality business, do you want to be in the situation where your valued guests are being notified by someone else, by the health authorities? You stayed at X hotel and X hotel exposed you to someone with the virus, or would you want to reach out and control that communication somewhat and be proactive and make the guest feel that their safety was taken care of? And this may be different answers depending on how much contact and how much information you have about the guest or the type of hotel or establishment that we're talking about. But it is a situation that comes up increasingly, because as people are returning to work and you have more individuals from different businesses interacting, you can have situations where the people who've been exposed to the sick employee are not your employees, and you need to determine what to do about that. In terms of the other question, what to do about employees who are afraid of contracting the virus, there are different standards depending on the reason for the fear. So if an employee is afraid that they may be at greater risk of complications if they develop coronavirus, which there are certain health conditions that can put one at greater risk, there is a process for seeking medical accommodation in that situation. So for example, an employee who has heart disease or diabetes or something like that, if they're not able to work on site, but they're able to work somewhere else, that may be an accommodation that is made in order to reduce the risk that they will develop very serious complications, and there's a process for that. If there is a situation where the employee is afraid on behalf of a family member, that is not so much a legal obligation to accommodate that. That is more a question of your workplace culture. Many hospitality employers view themselves like families. We have individuals, employees who have worked with the business for a long time. Their families are part of the overall corporate family. So here in the US, it's a bit of a question of how do we want to treat those situations, knowing that you have to be consistent and fair. You can't be providing accommodation to one person's spouse and not another person, or one person's child and not another person. But it is difficult because you have to make sure that the approach is, broadly speaking, fair. When we're talking about just the fear of the virus in general, which, to be fair, this is the 7th month that we're dealing with this in the US, and so it is very reasonable for someone to be afraid of contracting the virus. Our recommendation in the US has been to focus on adopting a good workplace safety plan, and that includes, taking steps to provide sick leave, to encourage sick people to stay home, having health screenings, making sure that employees are familiar with the symptoms and that they're monitoring themselves regularly and that they do not come to the workplace if they're sick. To some extent, we've adopted some of the measures that we saw in Asia early on in terms of temperature screenings and other kinds of symptom screenings to identify individuals who maybe are at risk. And then, having good practices inside the workplace, wearing masks and face coverings, engaging in social distancing, following all of the safety restrictions. And, our recommendation is that this can reset the conversation, that instead of talking about, the fear, which we all have, a very reasonable fear, we're talking about the steps that we have taken to make the workplace as safe as possible. And, if we all understand that we are in this together, that we are all responsible for each other's safety, then it becomes reasonable to ask that employee to come into the workplace and return. And because they can see that you've made the commitment, they understand that they have a role to play as well. And we just encourage that kind of communication, because this really is something that, regardless of what any federal or state or local government is doing, the responsibility really falls to each of us individually to keep each other safe. So that's the message that we try to use in that situation with employees.
Thank you so much. And I think what you brought up was an interesting segue here, which is, what are some of the differences between the obligations that you owe to an employee versus a contractor or a subcontractor? And I'd like to pose that question to Marion, if she can step in here.
Yeah, so from an employment law perspective, and of course I'll speak only from a Southeast Asia perspective. Of course, I mean, there are criteria that the court will look at and use to determine whether the people employed are employees or contractors. And this is, of course, of great importance, because if you only hire contractors, or what we call consultants, then you can terminate these people more normally, in principle, more freely. They are not subject to the protections brought by the labor code. So the implication is major. So in general, and again, it's difficult for me to provide you with a one-size-fits-all, answer, because the regime will largely depend on the jurisdiction where the employees or contractors are located. But in general, the main criteria will be the power of direction or supervision of the employer over the employee. So does the employer or the company has the imposes orders over the employee, and does the employee, needs to comply with it? If this is the case, in general, an employment relationship will be recognized. This will be the same with the working time. Does the employee or does the person, complies with the working time of the company? If this is the case, then in general, the person will be regarded as an employee. Remuneration also will be taken into account, because in general, for a contractor, the remuneration will be based on the results of the work done, and will be payable when the work is completed. Whereas for an employee, the remuneration will be paid on monthly installments. So it will be, there will also be a difference in terms of remuneration. Reimbursement of expenses as well. When the company reimburses the expense, in general, the person will qualify as an employee. And also the right, of course, to appoint a substitute. If you have an employee, in principle, he or she must, carry out the job, and he cannot, appoint somebody else to carry on the work.
Okay, and I think I'd like to also get Dragana's perspective from the European side. If there's, a major distinction in terms of the liability between an employer and a contractor with the with regard to the hospitality sector and the employee contractor relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is no. Basically, in all of our jurisdiction, when it comes to work safety, the obligation of the employer are the same regardless of whether the person working at the premises, are employees or freelancers, contractors working on hired based on other legal basis for work. So the obligations are the same. So theoretically, if you're obligated to provide the same level of protection, of safeguards, of preventive measures, also for the contractors, and also this means that in case the employee would be or the contractor would be able to prove that they contracted the virus or that there was some serious consequences arose from that, they will be able to seek damages from the employer. So regardless of whether they're an employee or a contractor, if it can be proven that your safeguards, the preventive measures that you were supposed to comply with as an employer were not at a satisfactory level.
Okay, so I think, moving on from this this topic, one of the issues that I think everyone is interested in, and I see from the questions that we've gotten from the audience as well, is what are some of the benefits that employees are finding to be the most beneficial to them, noting salary cuts or other measures that have been taken as a result of the pandemic. And I'd like to ask Aline to provide her input on this.
Yes, so actually I will share with you two things which are very specific to Accor, I would say, and who have helped us to make it as good as possible through this period so far. First, as I told you before, is a lot of effort on keeping a close relationship with the people wherever they are, be they lost on a resort in the Maldives or in the mountains in North Vietnam or so, but keeping this very strong network of relationship and courtesy calls. What we call courtesy calls, it means really much effort and time invested in talking to each other, which is very important when people feel they are alone somewhere and no visa, maybe end of a contract and so on. Plus this beyond even this question of talent, of keeping the best talents. It's really human beings, and we want to make sure that we connect to them and tell them, hey guys, we think of you, how are you doing, and so on. So very important. So courtesy calls, and it is also what happened to the employees of our corporate office here in Bangkok, 140 approximately, and it has been several months where no one was allowed back in the office. And now we are still not back full team, right? So 2 teams, but in the first period of a few months where everyone was supposed to be working from home, we had started a system of calling our HR team, divided the group of employees, and make sure that we give them a call, our colleagues, and asking them if technically, if how they feel, are they comfortable, anything to complain about their conditions, being the technology to be able to work, being the family environment, being the morale and everything. So it was very important, and some of us were even crying while talking. I mean, because it was like a lot of emotion. Okay, so I think this is definitely this part which is very specific, I think, to hospitality, where you have this human factor, probably even more important than in some other industries. The second thing is not that much. It's more finance. It's a very great initiative of Accor, who through his the chairman and CEO in Paris in beginning of April 2020, they have already decided to freeze a portion of the dividends which were planned to be distributed to the shareholders, and 25% of this amount has been dedicated to the creation of a fund, which we call Accor Artist Fund. Artist being the name that we give to all our talents, and there are more than 300,000 in the world, right? So the idea was part of these dividends will not be distributed to the shareholders and will be dedicated to relieve the financial distress of our talents all around the world. Financial distress in this period, it was mostly, of course, for people directly affected with the disease, maybe having lost their job or being on a very severe salary cut scheme, and because of that not being able for themselves or for their family to pay the treatment, the hospitalization, right? So it was the first thing. Second, now that the time is going through, of course, we have also people who were not too much affected at the beginning because they had some savings, and now are really running out of savings, and plus having family. And it's equal. I mean, it's not about local or of foreigners. It's not about low salaries or high salaries. Why? Because when you are local, you may have, and also being a rank and file, you may have a lower income. However, you may have no problem of visa. You may have more limited needs in terms of medical insurance, and you have your family. In Asia, you have really a community taking care of you. When you are a foreigner working in the foreign country, you may have also a family and far away from your relatives who normally would maybe welcome you in the family house or something like this. You know, you cannot even reconnect to your medical insurance. So even 6 months after the beginning, we are still every week distributing that money to people who have to shown that they are in financial distress. And not only the artists, actually artists means our employees are of course the first target, but it's also the individual partners of Accor and also frontline professionals and first responders, coming back to some point that another panelist were mentioning before. So this is an amount for our region here in Asia Pacific of more than $3.5 million, which have been already distributed for more than 13,000 employees, with an average of $300 per employee per month. Of course, this amount means a lot for local employees. You can imagine the average is higher for others. But I'm very proud of being in this company who had this initiative, who could afford to really put that in place, but also that brings a lot of hope for many people. And we are trying to distribute that in a way that we will go through the crisis, keeping them on board, even if the contract is terminated, and having a better chance also to get them back when it's over.
Thank you so much. I think, and moving on to Devjani, I'd like to ask the same question regarding what are some of the common benefit schemes that have been favorably received when you're dealing with restructuring issues and potential reductions in salary.
So again, here in the US, the really big issue is health benefits, not just because it's a global health pandemic, but because benefits are generally tied to employment. And so where individuals have lost their jobs, there are very few options for them to have health coverage. There's been a lot of attention paid over the last few weeks to some of the negotiations between the major unions and some hospitality employers that have resulted in employees being able to receive coverage for themselves and their families, in some cases through the end of 2020, even though they are not working, even though their employers may actually be closed. So this is a significant development for those industries, for those employers, and for those employees. Again, we talked about paid sick leave. That has been a big issue. And that is something where we've seen a lot of developments at the state and local level in terms of legislation to require employers to provide paid sick leave if they were not doing so already. Oddly, at the beginning of this, back in March, the federal government, for the first time in 2020, passed a very limited paid sick leave law, which was the first nationwide paid sick leave law that we have had, unlike many other countries. However, that law will also expire at the end of the year. So it remains to be seen whether we will have, some new benefit to take its place, either before our election or after our election. But those two things have really been the major components. The impact has been so great, and the decline in tourism has been so significant. In addition to restrictions that can affect hotels, such as restrictions on major events, large conferences, and so on. One of the things that I'm sure you're seeing on the real estate side as well is the role that business interruption insurance is playing. Many companies who had purchased business interruption insurance believing that something like this, an unforeseeable pandemic, would enable them to take advantage of these policies, are finding that coverage is not provided. So that will, I'm sure, be a source of activity for attorneys for many years to come. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think is just reality.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and it's the same thing that I think we're seeing from the Southeast Asia perspective. And I'd like to ask Marion to also weigh in on this, on what we're seeing in terms of policies from companies that are being that are considered to be a good thing for employees or that employees are valuing during this time of uncertainty and some restructuring activity?
So in Southeast Asia, of course, the situation is different than in the US, simply because, most of the jurisdiction where we are have paid sick leave. This is mandatory. This is provided by law. And I'll take the example of Thailand or Vietnam, but employees get at least 30 days of sick leave. So the situation is a little bit different. Of course, additional paid sick leave can still be offered. But in general, this is not as required by employees that it can be in the US. So now there is, of course, some benefits, that can be extended to employees but what we are trying to do as legal advisor is of course, in this tough time, we try to be inventive, creative. And how can you compensate employees who have accepted a decrease of remuneration or who have, consented to not get paid with their bonus? How, can you value that and maybe reward them on another way? So what I think personally is very interesting is why don't you, grant stock options to your employee? Why don't you grant free shares to your employee? Because this is a good way to associate them to the company, to ensure the talent maintenance. This is like a very vast topic. How do you, ensure the loyalty of your talents? So for me, this is really interesting. So in terms of free shares, either you grant free share on a voluntary basis, either you can agree with the employee that he or she will receive a percentage of his bonus, but in free shares. So in lieu of the bonus, the employee would receive free shares. And I'll try to be quick on that because I can see that we are running out of time. But another interesting option is what we call shadow shares. So shadow shares are not real shares. So this means that, there is no equity ownership that is passed to the employee, but it will allow the employee to get what we call a level of cash payment, which is normally tied to the value of the company share at the date of exercise. And of course, the date of exercise can be performance or time-based. But this is a good tool to say, okay, so right now, the situation is still uncertain, so we cannot, pay you the bonus right now. But look, if if the situation improves in the coming year or in the coming months or coming year, and the company's value is better, then you can, receive this cash payment. So I think this is a very interesting tool that we regularly propose to our client.
Okay, that's very interesting, and it's I like that there's a lot of different creative ways that employers are looking to keep their employees happy during this time, and really keeping employees, period. Noting the economic situation and the COVID situation. I'd like to call on Dragana if she'd like to give us some input in terms of just how the hospitality sector is evolving in her jurisdictions and what she sees moving forward.
Pretty much everything is on standby. So people are still waiting. This has been going on for quite some time, and the COVID is obviously going to stay here with us. So in Europe, we're just waiting to see what this upcoming winter will bring, because we expect another more peaks and surges and increases of the number of the people who are sick. So probably so even now during the summer, while we had the domestic tourism blooming, now in the winter months, probably that will not be happening. So and also there are a lot of in most of our jurisdictions, employers who accepted economic state aid measures. So finance aid measures in various forms. They had some time periods during which they were not able to dismiss employees due to redundancy. And now, this autumn and winter, we will see those periods expiring. So a lot of employees that used up those financial state aid measures will be, free to consider more redundancies. So what we are expecting are actually more redundancies in the near future in this sector, especially since we're not seeing the end of this, unless, of course, the governments come with a new set of economic relief measures, hopefully specifically targeted to those industries that are hit the hardest, as the hospitality industry. But as I said, what we see here currently, we don't see many changes. So most of our clients in hospitality industry are on standby, and also there were some M&A projects that were considered before the coronavirus epidemic hit. All of those projects were put on hold, and we don't see anything new coming up. But once we see an increase of redundancy cases, and then the fact that this has been going on for so long and will probably go on for quite some time, probably there will be another wave of new M&A activities that we will see in a few months. So this is, from our perspective as lawyers, what we see in the market.
And to pass that same question to Aline, as a representative of one of the largest brands in the world, what do you see in terms of the developments moving forward post-COVID, and how optimistic are you?
I am an optimistic person, so therefore I'm okay. I feel we will see the end of the tunnel. But of course, we were very enthusiastic at the beginning, and I remember in February, convinced completely that this whole story would be finished soon, and we would be back to normal in September. Okay, so I like to explain this picture I use sometimes, and I think it can. It's not only for hotels, but much more for industry, hospitality industry, because we are affected that much, like airlines. Yeah, about the impact of this crisis. We were ready to run a very speedy race, like a 100-meter race, and we are almost at the end. So we say, okay, we use our savings, but we will be soon at the end of, and very soon we will be back to the normal figures, right? And then when we are like 20 meters before the line, and already ready to go for the last sprint, then where we understand, we discover that it's going to be a marathon. So we cannot just stop. We have to continue running, but we have to adjust ourselves to a new kind of activity, of race, right? Which requires a completely different mindset, completely different management of resources, okay? And while we are still running, and while we don't even know if this marathon is 42, 45, or 50 kilometers, right? So there will be an end, for sure. There will be a vaccine, there will be something, but we are completely, that's the situation where we are. We are basically always optimistic person, and we feel that no one, as soon as there is a vaccine, as soon as borders open again, people want to travel, for sure, they will. Will they travel again as much as they used to do? Will they do things differently? And will we have, as an industry, have to adjust to the new requirements? Certainly, but they will travel, and we need to be ready. But the tunnel is much longer than initially expected. That's why it's difficult. So at this stage, even being an optimistic person, I try, like everyone else in Accor, to save, to protect myself, my family, my health, to make sure that I can support better the others. As HR, I have no other choice than I am here to support the hotels, right? So I need to be myself in a good shape. So my first effort was to really focus on my own balance, on my own health, to make sure I can go to the end of the marathon and support the others. Plus, be very flexible because things will change after that. After COVID, I don't know exactly how it will look like, but we will. I hope that we will learn from lessons. We will have our owners maybe to be more. To listen more to us when, as a management company, we ask them to put effort on the risk management, because that's where we see the difference between a hotel owned by employers who have neglected the risk management and others who have been more wise in that way. So I think next we will have less difficulty to convince them to put effort in the risk management. And then, yes, there will be also new creative, innovative ways of developing the business, certainly. So I hope this coming soon, but I don't see anything much before second quarter of 2021.
Yeah, and I think coming from the real estate perspective, that's pretty much what we're seeing from our side as well. In looking at the hospitality sectors, that we're expecting that things are going to be a bit unclear until the first or second quarter next year. So I think for us, it's going to be something that will develop over time. We're seeing requests for financing and refinancing from developers and hotel owners in terms of their new projects and their ongoing projects. But in terms of a fast recovery, I think we're not expecting that to be the case, and that there's going to probably be a lot of acquisitions over the next year, especially as larger, hospitality owners are going to be looking for opportunities to take over existing hotel assets, especially as new hotels start to come online. So I really want to say thank you to everybody that has joined us. I think we've gone through the questions that have come up during the course of our discussion, and we appreciate our audience sticking with us throughout this presentation. So I want to just say thank you to Aline and Devjani and Dragana and Marion for being excellent panelists and talking about a very difficult subject, but one that I think everyone really needs to understand in order to survive the ongoing crisis. So thank you again, and I'll let my fellow panelists here say a last word if they have anything they want to add. Okay, great. Thank you everyone so much for attending, and please let us know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out to any of us. Our emails are posted for everyone to see. So if you have questions in our jurisdictions, please feel free to reach out to us. We always look forward to hearing from you.